Christ comes and dethrones the gods, so they don't rule the world in this direct way anymore, and that's when we get Christendom. But then Christendom falls apart mysteriously, and something new is built in its place. And the question is, well, what is built in its place? We've called it secularism on this show. People call it modernity. And the main scholar that I'm going to be drawing on today, Oswald Spengler, calls it the Faustian age, and at the center, Faustian man. And I'm going to talk about that. But first, who is Faust? Who is Dr. Faustus? So Dr. Faustus is a German folklore figure. It's a famous old story. I'm not sure how far back it goes. It's popularized by people like Goethe and Marlowe. And the legend has all these kind of similar elements. So Faust is a scholar, he's a scientist, he's very educated, but he is very unhappy. All the things he's learned have made him unhappy. I think the line in Marlowe is, alas, poor fool, for all my lore, I stand no wiser than before. So he's miserable. And so, like all educated people, what does he do to solve his problems? Well, of course, he summons a demon to grant him knowledge and magic powers. And that's how he's going to make himself happy. He's going to understand the world better, because he's going to get secret knowledge from this summoned demon. And then he's going to use that knowledge for power, and he's going to use that power to indulge in pleasures. So he's going to we're going to see more of this, the connection between knowledge and power, which we've talked a lot about, and then the connection between, therefore, knowledge and power to gain pleasure and just have material satisfaction. So you may know Mephistopheles is the demon that he summons, not actually the devil, I think. It depends on which version of the story, but Mephistopheles is sort of hell's representative. And so he gets summoned by Faust, and he says, yeah, I'll grant you all these things. Classic deal with the devil situation. And he's going to serve Faust for a certain number of years, or for however long, under different conditions, depending on the version of the story. And then at the end of it, the bargain is that Faust will give his soul to the demon, and Faust will be damned. So sell your soul to the devil for all of these things. Okay, so that's the picture of Faustian man. Knowledge, power, which you get from this interaction with a fallen spirit, and you use it to pursue pleasure, and ultimately it leads to doom. That's the image that you should have in your mind about Dr. Faustus. So why does Oswald Spengler call this the Faustian age? Well, first of all, who is Spengler? Spengler, he's probably most famous for writing this book, The Decline of the West. And he wrote this, I think it was published in 1918. And it's this grand 1,000-page, 2-volume text about his thesis that the West is in its period of decline. Many people in the 20th century came to this conclusion, but Spengler does it pretty early, before the Second World War. And he predicts all these things that are going to happen to one degree or another. And in order to demonstrate and prove his thesis that the West is in a state of decline, and to predict the things that are going to happen pretty accurately, I would argue, is he has to come up with a way of viewing history. And I've talked about here, so ancient, medieval, and modern, I say I want to contextualize these things in terms of the worldviews of each period, and so does Spengler. But Spengler gives different ages. So he talks about how there's 3 ages: Apollonian, what he calls them, Apollonian, Magian, and Faustian. I'll say briefly what these are, because this is not a Spengler episode. So Apollonian, Magian, Faustian, what are these periods? The Apollonian period is his name for the classical era, the Greco-Roman world. And it's pretty much the same that you would imagine. Apollonian is just for Apollos. That's pretty normal. He has things to say about it, but it's basically the classical ages, you know and love it. Now, the difference is that instead of medieval and modern, he has Magian and Faustian. So that's the difference I want to focus on. Why does he have these differences? So for him, the Magian age is something like Christendom, Byzantium, and the sort of related philosophies that emerge from late antiquity through the early Middle Ages. So you might put the Magian age from like 1 AD or whatever, maybe a little later as Christianity develops, up until 1000 AD. I'm just going to, obviously Spengler, he goes into more depth. I'm going to summarize and generalize a little bit as we do. So what's going on in the Magian age? Well, he identifies, and I thought this was so interesting. The Magian age for him is, he talks about Judaism, so rabbinic Judaism, Islam, early Islam, not later Islam, and Byzantium, which I think is really interesting. What do these three things have in common? Well, in the early forms of Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, and especially Islam, there's a lot more mystic esotericism going on. There's an interest in sacred geometry and Kabbalah mysticism, and this is the great age of Islamic scholars when they were dedicated to doing philosophy with the best of them, and reading Aristotle and the boys, all these guys, Plato and so forth. And they're doing math, they're doing geometry, they're creating all this stuff. And there's this interest in understanding the world, but for Spengler, and especially when you add the Byzantine element, the similarity is that there's this kind of awe and reverence for the spiritual. There's a mystical quality to it that can't be understood. There's an emphasis on mystery and participation. And for Spengler, the symbol of this is the cave. And the symbol for him for the Apollonian period is the pillar, the Greco-Roman column, which you all know. Why the cave for the Magian era? Because the cave, like the cell of the hermit, the desert monastic, you go into it and you pray and you meditate and you have a mystical vision of things. So it's not a rationalist. It's not a rationalist pursuit. Magian, I think he's naming it for the Magi. And the Magi obviously are pagans. They're Persian. I think they're Persians, fire priests. And they read the stars, and then what do they do? They show up and they are some of the first people to acknowledge the true God, and then they worship him and give him gifts. So there's this sense of participation and mystery and acknowledgement and a direct interaction with the divine, and therefore some humility that I think you could say is common to all three of these things. And then what's interesting to me, what's the Faustian age? Why does he cut it off at 1000 AD? Well, for him, the Faustian age is the beginning of modernity, sort of the way we would talk about it. And most scholars talk, and me too, if you listen to the show, I tend to start modernity with 1500, with the Reformation. Spengler says what precedes the Reformation is scholasticism. So that's why he's putting it at 1000 AD, because in the late Middle Ages, the high Middle Ages, whatever you want to call it, the scholastic era, you start to get 1100, 1200, 1300, 1400. What's going on here? This increasing buildup of scholasticism. And why does he identify all of these things as part of the same spirit, the scholastic spirit, then the Reformation spirit, then the Enlightenment, and so forth? It's because they're all Faustian. And what's the Faustian formula? Use knowledge to figure out the whole world so that you can conquer nature. So that way man can then rule the earth and then pursue pleasures. So now pursuit of pleasure, obviously, to be fair, is not on the scholastics' radar. The guys who are doing all this stuff are monks. They're Catholic monks doing asceticism. They're not thinking of the world in terms of hedonism. That would come centuries later. But they are interested in this weird project, which is the university project, a project of synthesizing all knowledge and figuring out all of the fundamental, core, rational, mathematical, and logical causes of everything. So the project, in other words, the project of using reason to map out the entirety of reality, you're like, oh, that sounds like the Enlightenment guys and the scientific revolution and all that stuff. Great. Yes, I agree. But that's not where it started. This is part of the dumb myth of progress revisionism. It started in the Middle Ages, in the high Middle Ages, and that's essentially what scholasticism is. Scholasticism is the attempt to map out all of reality comprehensively through logic, through reasoning, through math. And it's sort of the beginning of an interest in what you might call practical science, what would later turn into empiricism. So the scholasticism thing, the famous system builders of the Catholic thinkers in this era, they do all the system building, which lays the ground for the Enlightenment. And then, of course, the Reformation lays the ground for the radical individual. So you got system building, totalizing, universalist kind of system building. Universalist in the sense not of universal salvation, but in the sense of we can create a universal rational model for all of reality. Unified field theory, you might put it that way. This is what the medievals were interested in. So the hyper-rationalism, then the Reformation, hyper-individualism, and then the Enlightenment, which is all about individuals using their rationality to conquer the world. They become deists, which is a hop, skip, and a jump to secularism and then to liberalism. And then Spengler says that after liberalism is socialism. There's more to his theory of history there, but without getting in the weeds on it, you see the progression here, which is from the rationalism of the scholastic movement to the individualism of the Reformation. And on those two ingredients, boom, you have Enlightenment, and then the rest of it secularizes over the course of time, as we talked about in the secular series. And so my hope is that you're able to kind of zoom out and look at all these things and say, oh, I see what Spengler means. These all go together in the sense that they're all Faustian.